fluid movement system provides a set of concrete movement guidelines that serve to reinforce the natural positioning of the body's center of gravity and the posture of the joints that make up the entire human movement system, otherwise known as the kinetic chain. It also provides us with a series of instructions for how one would sequence the response to the forces that are acting on the body, such as gravity or ground reaction force. The system was built upon a kinesiology model which teaches how the coordinated and reciprocating patterns of optimal human movement are facilitated by the two hemispheres of the body's kinetic chain. The fluid system teaches how the body is designed to move through efficient joint coupling sequencing and patterns in both hemispheres. Deviation from these patterns will result in movement dysfunction and then eventually injury. To understand these coupling relationships, we have to understand a number of initial factors, including joint posture, single joint motion, global joint sequencing, the effects of gravity, how the spine is positioned, and what direction the body is moving in. As a baseline, gait, also known as a person's manner of walking, which follows specific patterns of joint sequences, is the most natural physiological movement in which we can study coupling patterns for related muscular activity and also dysfunction. This is the basis for how fluid defines functional movement and how it progresses an individual through stages of movement awareness and competency. Today's video is intended to teach the basics of movement literacy, including single joint motion, the components of the gait cycle, and how efficient movement is sequenced or patterned. Our intention is to teach you a common language that creates alignment, clarity, and comprehension around human movement. For your convenience, we've organized a table of contents so you can refer to it to review any of the segments of today's video. If you have any questions on anything that we've gone over, make sure to reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. In this first segment, we're going to go over single joint or manipulative patterns of movement. These are single joint movements or bone movements, otherwise known as osteokinematic motion. So we're going to define the flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, internal, external rotations of all the joints and all the basic movement patterns of the body. Once we're done with that, you'll have a basic understanding of the terminology that you'll see in our classes and in our private sessions. A normal range of motion for shoulder flexion is 180 degrees. This involves moving your arms from palms against the side of your body to the highest point you can raise your arms overhead. A normal range of motion for shoulder extension to the highest point you can lift your arm behind your back, starting with your palms next to your body, is between 45 and 60 degrees. The normal range of motion of your elbow from full extension to full flexion is 0 degrees to 140 degrees. A normal range of motion of your elbow from full flexion to full extension is 140 degrees to about 0 degrees. The normal range of motion of your hip from full extension to full flexion is 0 degrees to about 125 degrees. The normal range of motion of your hip from neutral to full extension is 0 degrees to about 20 degrees. Normal range of motion using the anatomical position as 0 degrees is flexion at 0 to 140 degrees. Normal range of motion using the anatomical position as 0 degrees is full extension when it's at 0 degrees. Normal values for wrist range of motion are 73 degrees of flexion. Normal values for wrist range of motion are 71 degrees of extension. Posterior pelvic tilt is a movement in which the front of the pelvis rises and the back of the pelvis drops while the pelvis rotates upwards. Normal range of motion using an anatomical position as the starting point is roughly 8 to 12 degrees. It is normal to have a slightly anterior forward pelvic tilt of about 6 to 7 degrees. This is because of how the pelvis bones are shaped. Full range of motion is roughly 13 to 18 degrees. The lumbar spine has 5 vertebrae and connects the spine to the pelvis. Normal lumbar range of motion includes 60 degrees of flexion and 25 degrees of extension. The thoracic spine has 12 vertebrae and connects the lumbar to the cervical spine, along with housing the rib cage. Normal ranges of motion include 20 to 45 degrees of flexion and 25 to 45 degrees of extension. The cervical spine has 7 vertebrae. Normal range of motion for the cervical spine includes 50 degrees of flexion and 60 degrees of extension. Normal flexion to hyperextension at the atlanto-occipital joint ranges from approximately 15 to 20 degrees. The normal range of motion for ankle joint dorsiflexion was established as 0 degrees to 16 degrees non-weight-bearing and 7 degrees to 34 degrees weight-bearing. Normal range of motion for plantarflexion is 0 degrees to 50 degrees. The normal range of motion for humeral rotation at 90 degrees of shoulder abduction is 90 degrees of external rotation and 60 degrees of internal rotation. A shoulder pushing movement requires thoracic retraction, scapular abduction, protraction, upward tilting, and posterior glide. The arm flexes and externally rotates. A shoulder pulling movement requires thoracic protraction, scapular adduction, retraction, downward tilting, and anterior glide. The arm extends and internally rotates. A shoulder press movement requires thoracic retraction, scapular abduction, protraction, upward tilting, and posterior glide. The arm flexes and externally rotates. Lunging patterns require mobility through the hips, knees, ankles, and feet. Doing them correctly and in a proper progression can help increase mobility in these areas. The movement is initiated by moving the hips back and bending the knees and hips to lower the torso and accompanying weight, then returning to the upright position. Squats can be performed to varying depths. The expected range of motion is 90 degrees of pure glenohumeral joint range, 150 degrees of unrestricted shoulder girdle range. In supination, the calcaneus and foot move through a combination of inversion, adduction, and plantarflexion in relationship to the fixed talus. In pronation, the calcaneus moves through eversion, abduction, and dorsiflexion relative to the fixed talus. Supination and pronation occurs as the radius rotates around an axis of rotation that travels from the radial head to the ulnar head. There is 85 degrees of supination and 75 degrees of pronation. The normal range of lateral flexion of the lumbar spine is 15 to 20 degrees. The cervical spine's range of motion is approximately 20 to 45 degrees of lateral flexion. Normal values for hip abduction range of motion is 0 to 45 degrees. Normal values for hip adduction range of motion is 0 to 25 degrees. The normal range for scapular retraction and protraction is 20 degrees of protraction and 15 degrees of retraction from anatomical neutral. The cervical spine's range of motion is approximately 9 degrees of rotation on both sides. The C1 to C spine motion segment accounts for 50% of the rotation in the cervical spine. On average, each thoracic vertebrae can rotate approximately 3 degrees. Therefore, the entire thoracic spine should demonstrate between 30 to 35 degrees of total rotation on each side. The normal range for pelvis on femur external rotation is approximately 35 degrees. total range of motion is approximately 35 degrees, 23 degrees of inversion, 12 degrees of eversion. The normal range of motion for a healthy shoulder is 70 to 90 degrees of internal rotation. The normal range of motion for a healthy shoulder is 90 degrees of external rotation. The normal costal angle is formed by the blending together of the costal margins at the sternum. It is usually no more than 90 degrees, with the ribs inserted at approximately 45-degree angles. The normal range for femoral external rotation or lateral rotation is 40 to 60 degrees. The normal range for femoral internal rotation or medial rotation is 30 to 40 degrees. Now that we've gotten through manipulative patterns of movement, we're going to address the gait cycle. Remember that the gait cycle is made up of two real systems: compression and suspension. It's often referred to as stance side mechanics and swing side mechanics. Basically, these are reciprocating patterns, and they're made up of multiple manipulative patterns or single joint motion that couple together in a series. We're going to show you how the compression mechanics and suspension mechanics work together. Let's go ahead and get started. The stance phase of gait begins when the foot first touches the ground and ends when the same foot leaves the ground. The stance phase makes up approximately 60% of the gait cycle. The objective of heel strike or weight acceptance are to stabilize the limb, absorb shock, and preserve the progression of the body. In typical gait, the heel strikes the ground and initiates the rotation over the heel to foot flat to preserve progression. Single limb support involves progression of the body over the foot and weight-bearing stability. The first subphase of the single limb support is mid-stance. The second stage of single support is the terminal stance, which goes from 31 to 50% of the gait cycle. During terminal stance, the center of mass advances out in front of the supporting foot. The heel raises off the ground as you roll onto the ball of the foot, creating the third rocker motion of the cycle. The objectives of the swing phase of gait is to create a foot clearance over the ground, provide forward swing of the limb, and prepare the limb for stance phase. The swing size is made up of 3 cycles: pre-swing initial swing, mid-swing, and terminal swing. Pre-swing is the transition phase between stance and swing, in which the foot is pushed and lifted off the ground. During mid-swing, limb advancement continues, and the thigh reaches its peak advancement. During terminal swing, the final advancement of the shank takes place, and the foot is positioned for initial foot contact to start the next gait cycle. Now that we've gotten through the basics of the gait cycle, we can now start talking about how you're going to organize your movement through a process called feed-forward biomechanics. This is also known as proximal distal sequencing. What it basically means is that we move from the inside out. What we want to do is make sure that our bigger segments are supported and we're able to keep our upright center of gravity over our base of support as we move through space. There's a very coordinated and sequenced approach to movement that allows us to move efficiently through space without setting ourselves up for injury cycles. We're going to go ahead and talk about all the terms and what you're going to do as you move through space so that you can start organizing the way that you approach movement in general. Let's go ahead and get started. Proximal distal development means from near to far, with near referring to the very center of your body. When establishing efficient movement patterns, development starts at the center, with increasing control gradually spreading out from the center outward. The sequence first requires segmental control of the spine, then the shoulders and pelvis, then finally limb movement. Stabilize your lumbar spine by bringing the pelvis and thoracic closer together. This will bring your pelvis forward over your feet. Stabilize your thoracic spine by breathing in against the resting pressure of your abdominals. This lengthens your spine and prepares the pelvis to stabilize the body during stance. Rotation of the thoracic canister initiates gravity, preparing the leg to respond to ground reaction forces. Contract the gluteals of the stance side pelvis to stabilize the sacroiliac joint, allowing for efficient hip extension through the mid-stance propulsion phase of your gait cycle. The arm moves forward on the same hemisphere to provide opposing balance for preparation of the opposite side of the body swing phase. This lifts the hip and laterally flexes the spine, preparing the leg to move efficiently through the swing phase. Hip flexion draws the leg forward of your center of gravity in preparation for heel strike. As the leg advances to balance the opposite leg's compression and extension, contraction of the lateral flexors forces the spine to flex to the same side. The shoulder retracts and the arm extends to engage the large latissimus dorsi muscle, creating crossbody posterior stability. This connects the shoulder of the swing side with the hip of the compression side. The neck laterally tilts into the same side and rotates to the opposite side so that the head can maintain equilibrium. Remember that the stance phase of gait begins when the foot first touches the ground and ends when the same foot leaves the ground. Movement always starts from the stance side of your gait cycle. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this course on basic movement literacy. We taught you single joint motion, the gait cycle, and how movement is sequenced in an efficient manner. We know that sometimes learning how to move can be frustrating, and so it's important to have a common language so that we can all understand how to approach the solution with the right sequence and in the right understanding. By taking the time to learn these terms and understanding how to apply the movement in the right way, we can make sure that when we do move, the forces that transmit through the body are going to be controlled and to keep us from getting injured. Remember, if you have any questions on any of the content that we went over today, please reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. Remember that your body is designed to move, so stay in motion, and we'll see you soon.